April 1st, 1945. Easter Sunday off the coast of Okinawa. The sea was calm, the sky deceptively peaceful, but the American officers aboard HMS Indefatigable felt their stomachs tighten. They knew the pattern by now. When the sky went quiet, a kamikaze was coming. Moments later, a Japanese Zero burst through the haze at over 300 miles an hour, carrying a 550-pound bomb. It slammed directly into Indefatigable crowded flight deck. Aircraft were fueled, bombs were armed. This was the most vulnerable moment any carrier could face. The Americans braced for the fireball, the kind they'd seen consume Franklin, Enterprise, Bunker Hill. When a kamikaze hit an American carrier, it meant months of repair, thousands of gallons of burning aviation fuel, and death counts that haunted entire divisions. But this time, the inferno never came. The fire stayed on the deck, wreckage scattered, and 37 minutes later, the first Seafire landed safely. One American officer stared in disbelief. Then he turned to his British counterpart and muttered the line that would echo through naval history. When a kamikaze hits a US carrier, it's 6 months at Pearl. When it hits a limey carrier, sweepers, man your brooms. Long before the Pacific War reached its climax, a British admiral had already predicted exactly what would happen. Rear Admiral Reginald Henderson understood something few in the world appreciated. British carriers would not fight in the vast Pacific, where there was room to maneuver and hide. They would fight in the Mediterranean, the North Sea, the Channel narrow waters, where land-based bombers were always within striking distance. In the 1930s, before radar, before modern interception doctrine, the belief was simple: the bomber will always get through. Fighters couldn't stop everything. So Henderson came to a radical conclusion: if you cannot avoid being hit, you must survive being hit. The solution was audacious. Armor the flight deck itself. Not thin plating, but 3 inches of hardened steel, strong enough to carry the ship's entire structural load. Wrap the hangar in 4.5 inches of armored bulkheads. Make the carrier a floating armored citadel. Naval architect W.A. Forbes cracked the engineering puzzle in record time. What usually took years was compressed into months. On April 27, 1937, HMS Illustrious was laid down, the first of a class unlike any other in the world. Small air groups, but armored decks capable of surviving hits that would tear a wooden deck carrier apart. Henderson never lived to see his creation tested. He died in 1939, but his design would become the difference between life and death for thousands of sailors 6 years later. When the British Pacific Fleet arrived in 1945, Japanese pilots treated them exactly like American carriers. They dove at the same angles, they aimed for the same vulnerabilities, they expected the same explosions. What they found instead was 3 inches of British steel. On Easter Sunday, Indefatigable took her hit. 14 men died. A crater bent the deck, but the bomb detonated on top of the armor, not inside the hangar. Fires were contained. Damage control teams sealed the wound with concrete. The ship stayed in action. 4 days later, HMS Formidable was hit. The Zero struck at the seam of 3 massive armored plates. The blast sent shockwaves through the ship, killed crewmen, and tore a shallow crater in the deck. But again, the armor held. Within hours, she was launching aircraft. HMS Indomitable took 3 kamikaze attacks in 10 minutes. One Zero belly flopped across the deck and slid into the sea. Another was shot down mere yards off the bow. She suffered no casualties. She stayed in the fight. HMS Victorious absorbed 2 kamikazes in 6 minutes. One Zero carved a 25-square-foot hole in the steel, the deck sagging 3 inches. Aviation fuel lines erupted. Fires burned across the deck. But within an hour, she was launching aircraft again. American liaison officers watched all of this in shock. One of them literally threw his hat on the bridge and stomped on it, furious that an American carrier would have been crippled while the British barely slowed down. The contrast was brutal. Same attackers, same bombs, same tactics, but entirely different outcomes. The reason lay in four interlocking factors. First was penetration, a kamikaze hitting a wooden U.S. flight deck punched straight through into the hangar, detonating among rows of fueled and armed aircraft. That was how Franklin, Bunker Hill, and Enterprise suffered catastrophic losses. British armored decks simply didn't let bombs through. Second was aircraft handling. American carriers often had 30 to 50 aircraft parked on deck, fully armed, loaded with fuel, rockets, torpedoes, and ammunition. A single blast triggered a chain reaction. British carriers kept their smaller air groups inside the armored hangar between sorties, reducing secondary explosions. Third was fuel. American carriers relied on huge aviation gasoline reserves and open hangars that allowed fire to spread rapidly. British fuel systems were designed to be drained, purged with carbon dioxide, and isolated. Fires stayed contained. Fourth was timing. American carriers were most vulnerable when preparing to launch massive strikes. Franklin was arming aircraft at the time of her disaster. Bunker Hill was too. British carriers launched smaller groups more slowly, reducing the number of maximum vulnerability moments. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the Fifth Fleet, understood all of this. After USS Hancock was damaged, he specifically asked the British to strike the Formosa airfields because he believed their carriers were less vulnerable. That decision alone proved the Americans understood the strength in British design, but the armor came with a cost no one realized until after the war. The armored hangar created a huge, empty space inside the hull, a void that couldn't absorb shock properly. Repeated explosions, near misses, and kamikaze impacts warped the hull girders. Decks twisted, bulkheads buckled. Illustrious, formidable, and indomitable survived the war, but the structural strain they carried meant they were effectively dead ships. Repairs were too costly, they were scrapped within years. Only Victorious received a massive rebuild, so expensive that two sister ships' conversions were cancelled outright. Meanwhile, American Essex-class carriers, though devastated topside, remained structurally sound. They served into the 1960s and beyond. It's tempting to ask which navy got it right, but the answer depends entirely on the war each expected. The British expected Mediterranean warfare, bombers overhead, narrow seas, constant threat. Survival mattered more than carrying 100 aircraft. The Americans expected long-range Pacific warfare, vast distances, huge offensive strikes, and an air war defined by who could launch more planes first. The numbers tell the story. During the Okinawa campaign, American carriers destroyed nearly 2,000 Japanese aircraft. British carriers destroyed 75. But the intensity was incomparable. The U.S. faced 25 times more kamikaze attacks. Both designs were correct for their environment. And yet, when the war ended, the world quietly shifted toward the British philosophy. The U.S. Navy adopted armoured flight decks permanently. They adopted the angled deck, a British invention. They adopted the steam catapult, another British invention. They adopted the modern landing mirror system, also British. These innovations allowed jet aircraft to operate safely at sea. Without them, modern supercarriers like Forrestal, Enterprise, Nimitz, even today's Gerald R. Ford would not exist. British engineering reshaped naval aviation worldwide. Rear Admiral Henderson never lived to witness his carriers defy death in the Pacific. But his armored decks, his impossible idea, saved thousands. On those spring days in 1945, American officers watched British carriers take hits that should have killed them. They watched fires burn out instead of spreading. They watched aircraft launch minutes after kamikaze strikes. And they watched bombs explode harmlessly against 3 inches of hardened steel. The Japanese never understood why these carriers refused to die. The Americans could hardly believe what they saw, but the truth was simple. Henderson had built ships designed not just to win battles, but to survive them. And in the end, survival is what changed naval history.